ani bojo. Manono indishna kas makwadodam gayanga hago minwa jibwe nishna be kwendao swegi minwa wakum kong First Nation. So my name's Lauren Doxtater, and I'm going to talk today about First Nations relationship to rail. I am a researcher at NORDIK Institute, which is a community economic and social development research institute at Algoma University. I spent some time reviewing a bunch of information, literature, past excerpts, primary sourced, secondary sourced information, and compiled it into a literature review. And that's what I'm going to be talking about this morning. So the statement that you're reading on the screen is a sentiment reflected by Chief Isidore Day, who was chief of Serpent River at the time, and now is Ontario chief. Helps to build discussion of First Nation ownership, leadership of passenger services. This includes discussing how First Nation communities were affected by the creation of the railway. As a major component of colonization, the literature review describes how the Government of Canada was able to use policy and land ownership in the colonization process. Some of the stuff that Chief Paul Surratt had mentioned in his opening, this literature describes it even more in depth. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what has been researched in the literature review. Just to clarify, there are several terms that have been used to describe Indigenous peoples in Canada, such as Aboriginal, First Nations, and Indian. Because of the historical context of the literature review, I will be using these terms interchangeably. There's very little distinctly written about this topic. National policy trumped concerns if Indians could cope with the challenges of settlement and agriculture development, to which the railway companies, Indian Department, and Minister were committed. As such, little is recorded on this topic about First Nations persons, albeit they are recorded as a passing description in primary source journals and recognized as inconveniences to the economic prosperity that the railroad would create. Exceptionally rare is written text and documentation from the perspective of the First Nations bands and lack of historical content directly related to uprisings, confrontations, and claims with First Nations. And while this literature review focuses on First Nations' relationship to rail development, Métis peoples are suspected to have endeavored similar experiences with policy. The relationship that existed when contact was made by Europeans required the friendship, respect, and trust that First Nations were willing to offer, founded within the 1613 Goswenta or two-row wampum between Dutch settlers and the Haudenosaunee peoples. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 is the primary document that refers to Aboriginal title to land and the beginning of the transfer from First Nations to the Crown. This document allows the Crown to purchase land from First Nation bands and begins the formation of the numbered treaties. Treaties were created between the Government of Canada and First Nations, beginning in Eastern Canada with movement westward. These treaties were designed to appropriate the land, utilizing surveyed pieces of land reserved for Indians, and thereby Crown ownership of unreserved land was vested with the government and all socioeconomic profits forthwith. This new land development of reservations removed the traditional hunting and gathering that many First Nations were accustomed to and instilled invisible borders that inhibited prior connection to vast expanses of land. The reserves located within James Bay Treaty lands were selected by the commissioners after consultations with the Indians. These parcels of land were deemed supposedly advantageous to the First Nations, and selection was based on non-interference with railway development or the future commercial interests of the country. The treaty states that if reserve land is required to be used for public works, including railways, by the Dominion of Canada, bands will be compensated in equivalent dollars or land. The wording of the Robinson-Huron and Robinson-Superior treaties does not include that specific language. As for the Indian Act, the Gradual Civilization Act, and the Gradual Enfranchisement Act, were both created to slowly enfranchise an Indigenous person by allowing the same rights as a settler, such as voting and access to privately owned land. However, this land was removed from a First Nation community's already privately owned land. At the time of the railroad development in the 1880s, the Indian Act would be the vehicle to drive land transactions to rail companies and propriety on behalf of the Indian agent. And with that, all land-based decisions had to be made in conjunction with an Indian agent. The year 1887 sees the CPR building a spur line to Sault Ste. Marie. This line would be created in Garden River's fertile lands, and the band requested the line to be moved half a mile north. So for an example, there's a book called The Legacy of Shingwakones by Janet Shute. This describes how in 1911, the Canadian Pacific Railway, with the help of the Government of Canada and Indian Affairs, are able to work together to remove land rights from Garden River First Nation. So the issue is described as a trespassing claim by Garden River in regards to CPR extracting gravel from 32.3 acres of Garden River land base and selling it to local buyers. Indian Affairs ultimately relegated the band to the status of mere occupiers of the land, dropped the trespassing claim, and the CPR was successful in expropriating 32.3 acres of Garden River land, resulting in $5,282 worth of land and gravel sale, minus the legal costs. So they actually charged them, but then they actually took the legal fees. It took costs to take them to court out of the money. Another example is a quote that was from Shirley Horn, who is a Missinabee Cree First Nation member. To use her story, she keenly remembers how the passenger train affected her life in Northern Ontario, from using the train for hunting and the use for transportation to Shingwak Residential School. And finally, the literature review has identified some of the key players and their roles in land expropriation for railway use. It depicts the subjectivity policy had in restricting self-governing practices over land for First Nations. It also places the First Nation band within unfamiliar processes that have led to defeat on most of the claims and any justification of land tenure that they may have had. The research on the subject so far has yielded a substantial amount of literature from a Eurocentric perspective, including passing reflections on how the rail line was utilized for hunting and a means of labor for First Nations, but has yet to include First Nations worldview history and current reflections of rail in Northern Ontario. Thank you.